What is letting go? Letting go is the psychological process of releasing attachments to past identities and outcomes, and also relationships. The versions of ourselves that we held on to because they once felt like safety. A journalist at heart with a voice that is unfiltered, informed, and undeniably mine, where lived experiences meet perspective, refined, intentional, and unapologetic, told with clarity, and delivered with class. This is The Edit by Denasia and Ruth. Letting go isn't just mental, it's emotional, it's cellular, it's a full body shift. You aren't just releasing the identity, you are releasing the emotional safety that you thought it gave you. The brain clings to what it knows, even if it's hurting us. And for me, the identity that I nurtured for years, it wasn't quite true to who I was. But she was familiar, she was protective, and she was the only version of myself that I'd ever known. So when I started releasing her, it didn't feel like losing a pattern. It felt like losing a person. It felt like losing myself. Of course, it felt like losing a person. She carried you through every season of life that you weren't ready for. You weren't just letting go of her, you were letting go of who you had to be in order to survive. I've told you this. I told you before that she kept me safe, but I never told you how. I grew up to two parents from Miami who were still children themselves. My mom was 15 and my dad was 16. They came from their own history of pain and trauma, and so they weren't equipped to raise a child emotionally themselves. I was cared for in many ways, but emotionally, I just wasn't held. A good majority of my emotional needs went unmet most of my life. That shaped everything. When your needs go unmet in childhood, you build identities around absence, not authenticity. When people hear the word neglect, they usually picture a child without food, clothing, or shelter. That's only one piece of the story. Neglect is much broader, much quieter, and often much harder to recognize, especially when you grow up inside of it. If you're new here, I'm an educator of 4 years, which makes me a mandated reporter. In our field, we are taught to use the acronym SEEMED, a tool recommended in the book The Neglected Child. And so the guiding phrase is simple: if it seemed like neglect, report it. SEEMED breaks down 6 core types of childhood neglect, and it is a reminder that neglect isn't just physical. For many of us, it didn't show up in just one category, it showed up in several. Here is what SEEMED stands for: social emotional neglect, educational neglect, environmental neglect, medical neglect, ethical and moral neglect, and domestic and physical neglect. Social emotional neglect is when a child doesn't receive affection, comfort, validation, or emotional safety. This can look like being ignored when they're upset, being shamed for having feelings, or never being soothed, supported, and emotionally guided. This type of neglect is going to teach a child to disconnect from their emotions or to perform a version of themselves that feels more acceptable. Educational neglect can happen when a child's learning needs are not met. And so this shows up in ways such as chronic truancy, not being enrolled in school, learning disabilities being ignored, or not receiving support with their homework or school responsibilities. Educational neglect is going to often show up later as self doubt, underachievement, or feeling behind in comparison to their peers. Environmental neglect refers to the unsafe or unhealthy living conditions of a child. This can often show up as a home that is consistently dirty, hazardous, or has infestations. It has an unsafe structure, or the child may not have any clean clothing or hygienic support. This type of neglect is going to affect a child's sense of safety and stability. Medical neglect is when a child doesn't receive the necessary medical or dental care. It can look like untreated injuries, ignored illnesses, skipped vaccinations, and not receiving prescribed medication. Medical neglect teaches a child that their pain isn't important or that they must endure suffering alone. Ethical and moral neglect is when a child is exposed to harmful or unsafe environments. This often looks like witnessing violence, exposure to substance abuse, being encouraged to delinquent behavior, and living around illegal or dangerous activity. This type of neglect shapes a child's worldview and their sense of what normal looks like. Domestic and physical neglect is one of the most recognized forms of neglect because this can look like a lack of food, inadequate clothing, unsafe shelter, no supervision, being left alone in dangerous situations. Physical neglect is going to affect the child's basic survival needs, and it's the only part of the larger picture. Neglect is not always loud. It's not always dramatic, and sometimes it is the quiet absence of what you needed the most. And when you grow up in it, you don't realize that it's neglect. You just think it's normal. Before I continue, I want to make a disclaimer. I am not a licensed mental health professional. I'm an educator and I am a journalist by way of Clark Atlanta University. And everything that I share here comes from years of research, lived experience, reading, studying childhood development, becoming passionate about mental health along my own healing journey, and working closely with my therapist, including the homework and tools that she has given me. This content is meant to educate, bring awareness, and help you understand your own story more deeply. It is not a substitute for professional mental health care. When it came to this video in particular, I wanted to not only be able to provide you guys with the different types of childhood neglect, I also wanted to be able to give you the long term consequences of that, but I wanted it to be done in a way in which it would get you to be able to identify exactly what it is that you are trying to let go of. We all know exactly how it is that we have been affected in certain ways within our childhood, but sometimes it's really hard to identify the ways in which they have affected us, especially when it's not so visible. I have this article that I found on Love to Pivot that was written by Lori Jean Glass in October of 2022, but it was also reviewed by Kaya Enriquez, who is a licensed clinical social worker. I want to focus on this part of the article. What are the long term consequences of child neglect? Because we already know that all types of child neglect and abuse have lasting scars. For me in particular, we are talking about emotional neglect. And the scars of emotional neglect are some things that you just cannot see unless you were injured by way of self harm or you received a severe consequence from your parent. That was not my case. Another way that neglect may cause physical consequences is by inhibiting the development of the child's brain, leading to psychological issues. The most common long term consequences are usually, and these are all the ways in which I was affected and I did not know until I sought therapy. The feeling of emptiness and having no sense of purpose, not being able to identify or express your own emotions, attachment difficulties and fear of depending on other people, strong fear of rejection, low self esteem and self doubt, feeling different from others and having poor relational skills, lack of compassion for both yourself and others, constant negative feelings like shame, guilt, or self blame, not being able to stand up for oneself and be assertive, suffering from mental health issues, most commonly anxiety, depression, and PTSD, and high risk behaviors like alcohol and drug abuse, criminal behavior, or unhealthy sexual behavior. Neglect doesn't just hurt, it shapes who you learn to become. The mask I wore helped me survive all of that. These weren't flaws and these weren't symptoms. These were echoes of who she became to survive. It helped me move through the world while carrying feelings I didn't quite have the language for. I stayed attached to that version of myself because I knew that dropping the mask meant confronting everything that I'd avoided and everything that I thought I would have to live with forever. I didn't become this way by accident. And if I'm being honest, it was terrifying. Letting go is not about bravery, it's about honesty. And honesty is terrifying. I feared failing at becoming the healthier version of myself, but I also feared succeeding because I didn't have the tools to navigate life as my authentic self. I also didn't have any examples and I didn't have the guidance. You weren't afraid of change. You were afraid of feeling. 2 videos ago, I told you who this made me become. That version of me could never coexist with authenticity because, well, much of her was built from survival. Survival can look like personality until you're safe enough to see the difference. They were coping mechanisms disguised as personality and hypervigilance became a superpower. I learned to read people before they even spoke. Hypervigilance feels a lot like intuition when really it's fear masked as awareness. I adapted to tone shifts, footsteps, breathing patterns, gestures, anything that hinted at danger or disappointment. I molded myself to fit whatever the moment required. I people pleased in every environment where I didn't feel safe, and that cost me more than just myself. It cost me peace. Constantly reading the room, constantly scanning for danger. Awareness. That big fight with my ex wasn't the first time that I recognized these patterns within myself, but it was the moment that I realized I couldn't ignore them anymore. Sometimes the breaking point really is the opening. I remember thinking, you're either going to be just like your parents or you're going to choose to be better. The decision is yours. I resonate with two distinct roles that children play in dysfunctional family dynamics: the caretaker and the hero. That's the identity gap, the space between who I was, who I am, and who I'm becoming. It perfectly describes what it felt like to be between versions of myself. That in between is uncomfortable because you are letting go of one version and grieving that version in preparation of another. An embodiment for me at that time felt unsafe because achievement was all I'd ever known. I was so afraid at failing in trying to become the healthiest version of myself. My body was not resisting growth, it was resisting an unfamiliar safety. My mind didn't understand that I needed a regulated nervous system to take on this kind of work. And no, I wasn't regulated when I actually took the leap, but I finally understood that what was happening inside of me, I could finally name it and I can see it. Most importantly, I started crying again. I don't know who needs to hear this, but tears aren't weakness. It's evidence that your body finally feels safe enough to feel. It made me realize how much I had suppressed, how much I had avoided, how much grief I've actually been carrying. Being able to cry again, it's not regression, it's return. The release showed up in ways that made my inner child cry in relief and my inner teen jump for excitement at all the possibilities ahead. They weren't just relieved and hopeful, they finally felt seen and finally had a future. I'm really sharing all of this because I want to ask you, what identity did you build from survival? What parts of you are ready to be released? What part of you feels like returning? Which versions of yourself are you becoming? Don't rush your answer. The version of you that you built, it kept you alive. So be honest with yourself because the version that you're releasing deserves recognition too.